Hello, my name is Rebecca Lee and I'm Head of English at a school in Salisbury, and this session on whole class feedback is brought to you from the blandest room in my house, which is my spare bedroom, which you can see behind me. And I just want to get in really quickly, a quick disclaimer that this is the first time I've recorded something like this to go out beyond my school. I hope you'll find it useful and I hope you'll find it interesting. But if after this session you've got questions or challenges or feedback, then by all means tweet me and I'll hope to get back to you. And essentially, this session is a follow-up to a blog post I wrote a few years ago on whole class feedback when we first introduced it in my department. And I was just going to write another blog post, and then I thought instead I would embrace this technology, this Loom medium that I've been using over lockdown to instead record a video. And I think there's a few silver linings to some of the things that have happened over the past few months. And one of the silver linings has been that there's been really great access to some brilliant CPD online. For example, most recently last weekend, Research Ed Surrey, there were some fantastic sessions that you could watch from the comfort of your own home in your pyjamas. Just all you had to do was just log onto the computer. And I think that's a great thing. And that's part of the reason why I've decided to record this rather than just write another blog post. But I guess it's a disclaimer just so that you know that this may not be the slickest thing you've ever seen in your life. What you may find is if I completely screw up a section, then there will be a bit cut out and you will just see me be at this stage and then suddenly it'll cut and I'll be here. I've learned to edit Loom videos is what I'm saying essentially. I think there's been a resurgence in interest in whole class feedback over the past few weeks because when schools have been reopening, they've been thinking about how to do it as safely as possible. And rightly, one of the things that has happened is that schools have thought about how to minimise teachers' contact with books. And some schools have used gloves and shields, etc., and are still continuing to mark books. And I think whatever schools are doing is completely up to them as long as it's safe and within the regulations. But I know a lot of schools have moved to kind of reducing that contact and using whole class feedback. And I think, or I hope rather, that this is going to be one of the other silver linings of COVID-19 and the way we've had to change our practice, is that I'm hoping over the next few months where schools have moved away from marking books and writing in books lots and lots and moving towards whole class feedback, that teachers and SLT and schools more widely are going to see the value of whole class feedback instead of lots and lots of marking in books. So what I'm going to do in this session, I'm just going to minimise myself. So I was just big for the introduction, but I'm just going to make myself a little bit smaller. In this session, I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of background about whole class feedback and marking versus feedback. I'm going to talk about why we use whole class feedback, how we use whole class feedback in my department. I'm going to share with you a few recent examples over the past few weeks, and I'm going to kind of respond to a few of the questions that people on Twitter posed to me over the past couple of weeks about whole class feedback. And I hope that if I haven't been able to answer them in the main body of this presentation, that I can answer them at the end. But if you are watching this and you've still got questions, then as I said, do just tweet me and I will get back to you. So I went onto Google and I typed in exhausted teacher, and this was just my favourite image because look at its little face. But in all seriousness, I think that whole class feedback is the one of the biggest wins is that this is a good thing for teacher wellbeing. It's not just good for student progress, and I think it is. I think we need to move away from this martyrdom of teachers and this fetishization of marking, because it's having a detrimental effect on teachers' well-being, and it's leading to, or I believe it's a really big contributing factor to the recruitment and retention issues with our profession. And last year, so academic year 2019 to 20, I made a commitment to myself that I was not going to bring any books home, and I managed to keep to that promise to myself throughout all from September till when we had lockdown at the end of March, I didn't bring a single set of books home because of whole class feedback, and that had a huge impact on my well-being. It meant I wasn't lugging big bags home. It meant I wasn't sitting in a room with kind of the books in the corner of the room, and I know they're there, and I know I've got to mark them at some point. It's been brilliant not bringing books home, and of course that doesn't mean that I'm not working at home, but I'm doing other things at home that I'm more enjoyable, planning for my lessons, planning for feedback. I'm not sitting there with a big pile of books, spending 2 or 3 hours writing in them. So I typed in exhausted teacher because I think that that's the thing I want to talk about first, is that the main reason why I think whole class feedback is a really good thing is that it's a win for teachers' well-being, which is important, because if we're going to give our students the very best, then we need to look after our teachers, and we need to do marking and feedback in a way that's not going to burn us out within the first few years of our career or put us off entirely. And I think it's brilliant that this is obviously meant to represent a teacher, and the mix of a check shirt and the diamond sweatshirt is brilliant. And that I thought, if you type in exhausted teacher, you'll see a few of these. And of course, you can't be a teacher unless you've got an apple in your hand here. But I think we can all sympathise with feelings of exhaustion as we approach the end of term one of probably the oddest term in our careers. But I hope that if you start to use whole class feedback, you're feeling less exhausted than you might have done in ordinary times. So I'm going to talk, this is the background bit of this session really, is a little bit about marking and feedback. And in a lot of departments, in a lot of schools, there's still a real drive to put marks on work, both Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. So at Key Stage 3, what we had is lots of schools moving away from levels, SATs levels, and then made up their own levels or their own words to describe where a student was. And at GCSE, of course, we still have teachers trying to apply a grade to students' work over the course of a year. And I think the reason why lots of schools still do this is because there's a belief that this putting a grade or a word or a phrase on a student's work has some kind of shared meaning, that if I say a piece of work is a grade 4, that means something to me, to other teachers in my department, to my SLT, to the student. But I have a couple of challenges about that, and about whether that's accurate and how distracting that is. So I'm just going to start by talking about marking and putting grades on things and how accurate we think that is. And I'm just going to move me a little over here. I'm going to move moving to the middle here. So this monster just here, this is meant to represent the data monster. And I think part of the reasons why we are still kind of fixated on putting marks on things is because of a drive in schools, and lots of schools are still having a drive on feeding the data monster, that at 6 weekly intervals, hopefully not even more than that, but certainly a lot of the schools I've worked in the past, it's been every 6 weeks you put a piece of data into the Sims or whatever system you have, and you're feeding that data monster all the way through the year. And so you can't not have a piece of work to mark. You need to have some kind of marking system. The problem with that, first of all, is that I think it leads to an issue with how you are designing your curriculum. That, for example, in English, and obviously I teach English, so I'm going to give an English example. What that might mean is that instead of interweaving parts of your curriculum over a longer period of time, you might feel that you need to have a massed practice of something over 6 weeks. So, for example, 6 weeks on how to write a persuasive letter. And then at the end of the 6 weeks, you write a persuasive letter, and that is marked, it's given a mark, and then it's fed to the data monster. And then next time you move on to something else. And I have a real issue with that, because I think that assessment has been part of the reason why we have curriculums that are in six weekly blocks, rather than thinking about what is the most effective design for curriculum. And I'm really lucky that I work in a school that only demands, we have 3 data drops a year. So from September till Christmas, my department do not put a mark on students' work at all. We just don't do it. The feedback, students are still getting regular feedback, but that feedback is formative, and we use whole class feedback to do that. So we're not putting grades or marks on there at all. And I'm very fortunate to work in a school that doesn't demand, such regular data drops. But also in terms of accuracy, this issue about the bell curve, because of course what we know about GCSEs is that you can only assign a grade, or a grade is only assigned after everybody has sat the exam, and then they decide where the grade boundaries are. So it's a complete fallacy, isn't it, to suggest that I know what a grade 4 is or what a grade 5 is. I don't. I might be able to say with some confidence that a piece of work is this level or that level if I'm looking at the English mark scheme, for example. For English language, you've got level 1 to level 4, and literature you've got level 1 to level 6. But even then, we could disagree about how many marks or what level would give something. And if you've been teaching for as long as I have or longer, you remember the days of the coursework moderation booklets and having meetings with people where you are disagreeing by quite some margin of error about what marks you think those are given. So I think accuracy is really hard when it comes to marking, and I think it's bit of a fallacy to think that we're very good at being accurate in our marking, and that it's actually giving us a meaning that is what we think it's doing. But what I think teachers are good at is knowing what students have done well and what they need to work on. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's certainly easier for us than trying to then twist that into some kind of grade. And I think we should celebrate the fact that we are good at looking at a piece of work and saying, well, this is what you've got right and this is what you need to work on. And that's what students need to hear. That's what students find useful, is knowing what they've done well and what they need to work on. So that's just a little bit of talk about kind of accuracy. And then, of course, there's the issue that putting grades on work is a distraction. Students tend to look at the grade and ignore the feedback. That's why I've got this little kitten here. Because it's distracting. Because if you are anything like me, when I was at school, I wasn't interested so much in the feedback. What I was interested in is looking at the grade I got and then working out how I compare to my peers. And I just think it's such a shame, isn't it, when you've got teachers spending hours and hours writing beautiful comments, sometimes really witty or like funny comments or really personal, and they're spending lots of time putting those in students' book, and we think that's a really good thing, and then students are kind of looking at the grade and ignoring the feedback. And I think a marked improvement, which it came out in 2016, is a really good thing to read from the EEF, looking at the evidence of written marking, and the evidence is pretty thin on the impact of written marking, and I wonder why we're still so desperate to cling on to it. So I'm going to talk about our journey with whole class feedback, my department's journey with whole class feedback, and it starts with this blog post about marking crib sheets and whole class feedback. And I also read about what Michaela were doing in terms of not marking books and giving whole class feedback, and it inspired me to introduce that into my classroom. And initially I was just trialing it in my classroom with my students. So from autumn 2016 I started at the school I'm at now, and I started using whole class feedback, and I wanted to see how it worked. And then by spring 2017, we started using it as a department, and I wrote this blog post on whole class feedback. And as part of that blog post, it's still on my blog, so you can have a read. But it kind of talks about this a marked improvement, a review of the evidence on written marking. And I have to say it was a real game changer for me, because I went from spending on average 3 hours marking a set of 30 books to being able to look at a set of books and prepare my feedback in about an hour. And I mean, that's a huge amount of time, and especially when you are trying to give feedback to all of your classes every other week, that adds up pretty quickly. So I'm just going to talk about a marked improvement. Spring 2017, I also went on a 3-day course. It was spread out at Huntington Research School, and went on a course called Leading Learning, run by Alex Quigley. And one of the things that was shared there was a summary of the findings of a marked improvement. So I can't take credit for this summary, but I'm just going to share it with you. And I'm not going to read this out to you, because you can pause me and you can read it. But the key things from that a marked improvement review of evidence and written marking is that if students are given the lesson time to respond to feedback, then coded marking is just as effective as written comments. And I think that if you are writing out the same comment time and time and time again, you might as well just write out a number and explain to students what that number means. It's just as effective as writing it out. Highly specific targets are obviously a good thing, so that students know exactly what they need to do. I can't remember who said this, but the kind of feedback that's equivalent to saying to a comedian, well, you need to be funnier, is not helpful feedback. What specifically do I need to do to be funnier? Which obviously isn't easy when it comes to comedy. But with writing, write more effective descriptive writing, or there's other things that you could say that which wouldn't really mean anything to students. Specifically, what is the thing they need to do? We should focus more on quality of feedback as opposed to quantity and frequency, and feedback should be timely. And it's part of the reason why verbal feedback is more appropriate oftentimes than written feedback, because there's that lag. There's always going to be some kind of lag. If you're taking in books, there's going to be at least 24 hours, I guess, between taking in books and giving that feedback. Whereas if you can do it immediately in the lesson, then that's going to have real impact, because students are hearing straight away what they need to do. Now, that's one of the things we found quite tricky with having to maintain 2-metre distance from students, is that we're not able to give that immediate verbal feedback in a way that we would ordinarily do. And I'm sure you're finding that challenging as well. So why do we use whole class feedback? Well, first of all, it's quicker, as I've already talked about, which is important for teacher wellbeing. And I always want to think about what's going to still be effective, but support my teachers, and to make sure that they're spending time on the things that they most need to spend time on. But as well as being a good thing for teachers, it also has benefits for students, because they're more likely to receive more timely feedback. I am now in a position where I can take in a set of 30 Macbeth essays, as I did this week, on a Monday, and I can give students feedback on a Tuesday. Then the very next day they can get the feedback from me. In the past, there would probably have been a lag of a weekend, because what I would have done is set the essay, I would have taken the books home over the weekend, and then students would get the feedback the following week. And that's obviously not as timely or going to be as effective as the very next day. Whole class feedback allows you to see and share common issues and misconceptions, and most errors are common across a class. Generally speaking, there's an issue, a common misconception across the group of students. Unique errors are rarer than we think they are, actually. And by collating it together in this way, you see those common issues and misconceptions in a way that you probably wouldn't do if you were diving your way through a whole set of books. And finally, actually, students like it. So we've been doing this now for 2 or 3 years, and we get feedback from students. And bizarrely, one of the things they said is they felt it was personal, it was individual. And I know some people are concerned about whole class feedback and how individual that feedback can be, but students have certainly said to us that they like it. They like the regularity, they like the sheets themselves, they like being able to see exactly what's gone well and what the targets are. and they feel like it's personal to them, despite the fact it's a whole class feedback system, which I think is interesting and something I probably need to unpick a little bit more with students. And one of the things that's changed this year in our school compared to previous years of using whole class feedback is that we're now not writing in books at all. And that's because of COVID-19 reducing teachers' contact with books. Instead, we're taking books in, having a look at a piece of work, obviously sanitising regularly between books, but we're not writing in books. And what I need to do is I need to get some feedback from students about the impact of that and how they're finding that, because that's a change for us. And how we use it. So first of all, and I'm going to show you a few examples of this, what I do is I take in my set of 30 books and I have a bit of scrap paper, and as I'm looking at an individual, I tend to target one bit of work. I will sometimes have a quick flick through their books to just see what they've done recently or to pick up anything that I might miss, but I have a look at a specific piece of work and I will make notes on a rough notes on a bit of paper. So I'll write down strengths and targets and spelling errors as I go. And what I find is the first few books are a little bit slower because I'm writing down targets that I'm seeing perhaps in only one or two books, and then it gets quicker because I start to see the same things, and then I can start to see the pattern and where this whole class feedback is going to go. I then, when I've finished making my rough notes, and it'll take me about 30-40 minutes to read through all the books and make the notes, I will then take those notes and I will put them into a template. Now, that's just how I do things. Some of my department do things slightly differently. I don't think it matters. I think you could write on a sheet and just display that on the board. You could have a set template. You can change the template every lesson. I think it doesn't matter, but me personally, I like putting it onto I have a PowerPoint template which I've shared a few examples on my blog. It's very quick, it's neat. My writing tends to be a bit scrappy. And it also means when I print off the 2 PowerPoint slides a page, students have a small copy of that in their exercise books. And that means the next time we do a piece of work like that, they can flick back and it's really easy for them to see the targets or whatever else is on the sheet. And I'll show you a few examples in a moment. And then we have feedback lessons, and students have feedback lessons in our school, in my department, every other week. And in those feedback lessons, and we have a whole lesson for this, the teacher will go through the feedback, they'll share some really good examples using the visualizer, and then there will be a follow-up activity. So that might be the teacher modelling something, it might be the teacher reteaching, there might be some drilling, and there might be some redrafting. The main thing is what is the thing that is going to help the students improve? In the past, we used to do a lot of redrafting work, and actually the more I think about it, the more I think that that's maybe not always the best thing to be doing in the feedback lesson, because I think it leads the student to think about improving the work rather than thinking about how to develop in that particular area that the feedback has been focused on. So I've been trying to certainly move away from redrafting as the go-to for feedback lessons and thinking instead, how can I use this lesson to make sure that students are getting better at this thing, whatever it might be. I'm going to share with you a few examples of what I've done in feedback over the past few weeks. Okay, so I'm going to share 3 different examples. The first one is from a few weeks back, and it's year 10, paper 1, question 5. Here is how the board will be at the start of the lesson. Now, because we have students coming into lessons and we're greeted at the door, they've got to sanitise and then get in. We've got a system for books being handed out, etc., etc. So I want students to have something to be getting on with straight away. So this is the do now activity, the title's there, the date's there, and I've got the spelling errors that I've picked up as I've gone through the work. And what I want students to do at the start of a feedback lesson is reread their work. And I've given them the time at the start to do that, because I think that then when they get the feedback from me, they're more easily able to identify what applies to them because they've just reread their work. Whereas if I already had my feedback stuck in their books, or I'd already written in their books, I think there's a chance that they're less likely to do that. They're just going to look at what I've written or what I've stuck in instead of reading their work again. Then what I want them to do is I want them to see if they've used any of the words that are on my list on the right. And if they have, highlight them and correct them in their books. We don't have dictionaries in my department anyway, because my feeling is if they don't know how to spell it, they're not going to be it's going to be a waste of time them finding the word in the dictionary. I'd much rather just give it to them. And then with this particular class, I had some real issues with presentations. So I've put the students' initials here just to give them a kind of a nod really that they need to sort out their presentation. And I know some people are concerned about whole class feedback and the potential for calling students out. I think you have to know your class, and this is appropriate for my students. They know me, and that as a class we're building up a good relationship, and I think they're okay with being initials. They might feel a bit different if I put their names up, and of course students can work out who it is if they really want to. But there's enough people here that this isn't just picking on one or two people. There's I wanted to make sure that their presentation was better than it was when I looked through their books, and because we're not writing in books, I don't want students to think that it's not important for them to present their work neatly, because ultimately they are the audience for their book. The work that they're doing in their book is ultimately going to help them with their revision when they get to the exam, and I want them to be able to read their notes when they get to the exam. So I think it's fair enough, but I can understand why you might not want to do this, in which case you could just put the general rule and ask students to check through and make sure they're presenting their work neatly. So this is the first portion of the feedback lesson. I will take the register, etc., and then we will move on to the next part of the lesson, which is me giving feedback. And at the moment, students don't have anything stuck in their books. I want them to listen to me giving the feedback and not be distracted by the sheet in their book. I just want them to engage with me. So the task that they were doing was to write the opening of a story set in an abandoned place, and I've included that just because it's helpful for me when I kind of look at the feedback. And I save these sheets so it's useful for when I'm reusing them. The first thing I do is I always start by talking about strengths and the things that I've been really pleased about when I've been looking at students' books. So the strengths, the things that I've seen that I've been impressed by, and then I will look at a couple of student examples, and I'll show you a bit later on how I set this up, because we're maintaining strictly our 2-metre distance. So in the past I would have just asked a student to bring their book up and I'd have taken it from them and I'd put it in my desk, but we're not doing that. So I've used my visualizer setup away from my desk, and we will look at a couple of student examples. And I think it's important for students to see things that their peers have written and see what people they know have been doing it or have, and how other people in the class have responded to the very same task. Little star, because why not? And then I will go through the general targets. And I'm trying not to overload students by focusing on too many different things. I'm thinking about the general issues across the class. So there were a fair few people who were having issues with their paragraphing. So that's the first thing I've picked up on here. An issue across the class about varying sentence structures. And then some common but kind of things that I'm not going to tackle in this feedback session, which was about maintaining the same perspective and reminding them about the importance to maintain a perspective, for example, third person past tense, and then expectations about how much they should be writing the time that they've allowed or that I've allowed. So having looked at students' work and having gone through this feedback, I then thought about what was going to be the most useful thing for them to do in the lesson. And I thought the thing that would have the biggest impact and the most immediate impact on their writing was about varying sentence structure. So that's the thing I've decided that we would use the rest of the feedback lesson on, is I wanted them to play about with upgrading a few sentences using, I've printed a grid off for them, which I'm going to show you in a minute, which I think upgrade your sentences came from Grania Hanahan, and I think it's a brilliant resource. And so students had access, stuck that in their books, and they can refer to that. And what I've asked them to do is pick out a few sentences from their work and then have a go at upgrading them. And then the next time that they're going to do a piece of writing, they've still got this sheet in their books and they can refer back to it, and they've still got that support and a range of ways that they can upgrade their sentences. So here's I'm going to move myself down here now. Here's the sheet, and you can see that there's a range of different options for them for upgrading their sentences. They could start with triple noun colon, they could use an embedded clause with brackets, etc., etc. Now, one of the questions I got about whole class feedback is, how do we use whole class feedback when we've got sporadic attendance? And I think it's a really good question, because what we don't want to do is have a feedback lesson where if you weren't here for the work being done, you've got nothing to do. So I always try and think about my students who weren't there and what they could do, what's going to be useful for them. And by it not just being a redrafting task, they've got something they can immediately have access to and that will help them, because the chances are it was such a common issue across the class that it would have been an issue for them as well. So I had a couple of students absent when we did the assessment, not the assessment, the writing challenge that they did. And so I said, if you were absent last lesson, then this is the question that you need to, this is the sentence that you need to upgrade. The boy was bored, and I wanted them to try and work their way through all 9 of those, which is a closed activity that they can focus on and move on with, which worked really well actually. So that was paper 1, question 5. Now, one of the questions I got was about how you're making sure you're giving personal feedback. Now, the truth is, because I've looked at the books the evening before, I remember an awful lot of what I've seen, and so I'm able to have conversations with people, and I can go, so and so, I was so impressed with the way you opened that, or I thought it was a brilliant use of metaphor in your, I love the way that you ended that piece. And I try and do that a lot, but also in terms of praise and students' work that I'm looking at, I will keep a track of that, so that I'm thinking about making sure that we're hearing from a range of students, that at some point over the course of this term or year, students will see their names there and be recognised. But also, I often do one-to-ones in the feedback lesson. So once students are set up with this task, I can then have one-to-ones with students. So they'll bring their work up to the visualizer station at a distance from me, and we can have a talk about their work. And that has been working really well. And that verbal feedback is still a part of the feedback lesson. So I'm going to now talk about paper 1, question 3. So this is again year 10s, looking at AQA English Language paper 1, question 3. And I thought I'd take this. So this is recent. This is this week. I think this was Monday I took in their books, and I gave the feedback on Tuesday. And I've just scribbled out the names. So you can see here how rough this is. And a new thing I tried this week, because in the past we would have written, we would have used whole class feedback, but we would have written what went well, even better if, and we'd have used coded feedback for that. And we're not doing that at the moment because we're not writing in books at all. So what I thought I would do instead is I would, students have a number 1 to 30 depending on where they are in the alphabet in the class, and so that they are getting specific feedback for them. If I've noticed something that's specific to them, although rarely it's just one student, I've put their number next to the target here. And you'll notice down here, I started getting so many people that this was clear to me that this is the thing that we all need to work on. So this is an example of the rough sheet. And then again, it's like I did with the paper 1, question 5. The first thing students are doing is rereading their work and with fresh eyes, reflecting on it, and then they're checking their spellings. And then this is the feedback sheet. So again, starting with strengths, what I was impressed with. And I have to say that I was blown away by this class. And that we teach in mixed-ability classes, but this class in particular wrote some fantastic, I think I've not had such good first attempts at paper 1, question 3. So I was genuinely really impressed, which I wanted to convey to them, and what they've all done really well. Then we looked at quite a few student examples here because I wanted them to see how different students had handled what is quite a tricky question, or which can appear quite a tricky question, which I think students sometimes overcomplicate, but this class had managed really, really well. And then I went through some of the more specific targets. Now, if there was, you'll see on my sheet, I've only put 4 here. If you can see here, I've got quite a lot more targets. Now, if I've only got one student who it applies to, I would make it my mission to kind of talk to them over the course of the feedback lesson, or make them aware of that through one-to-ones. So these are the ones that apply to more than just one student, but not everybody. And then these were the things that I thought that everybody needed to work on, that there was work to be done on the specific impact of the order of the text. What does it make the reader think, feel, or imagine? And that students need to stick with that and explore that in more detail, and that what might be helpful for them is using a range of words to analyse the impact. So I included those on the sheet, and then students have those for future, that they can use a range of these analytical verbs here to analyse the impact that it has on the reader. Now, for what happened in the rest of the lesson, I had a couple of one-to-ones, but I gave students, inspired by Lindsay Caldwell. I saw her at Research Ed Surrey last year, but there's also her more recent session from Surrey this year, which explores a similar theme about differentiated modelling, looking at 2 examples side by side, at different levels. So low access, high challenge, looking at 2 examples of writing next to each other. And that's what I did in this lesson. We looked at 2 examples next to each other. So we looked at a level 2 to a level 3 and a level 3 to a level 4, and students were picking out what was being used and what was effective, and looking at the use of these analytical verbs to talk about the impact. And we're going to pick up on that in future lessons, although I was really happy with their responses, but something that I thought they could work on, and that would be the best way for illustrating it to them. And then the other thing I did this week with my Year 11s, we use whole class feedback for essays as well. So students in Year 11 do an essay at least every other week. And that is something that used to take a long, long time to mark, but thankfully it doesn't now. So we are focusing on Macbeth at the moment, and here is my scrappy sheet here. And you can see I'm crossing off the spellings. That's just as I'm putting them over onto the what's it called? Template. I've forgotten my words. So that's just when I put them over onto the template. And exactly the same as with Year 10s, the starting activity is that students come in and they reread their work, and I get them to write a short reflection, fresh eyes, what do they notice, what do they think themselves about what's good or not, and then again checking spellings. And then again, starting with strengths, what have they done really well, what was I impressed with, looking at a few student examples, and then kind of bit by bit going through the targets. Now you'll notice here what I've asked is for students to highlight the ones that are relevant to them. Now, because they've just read it as I'm going through this, because they've just read their work, as I'm going through this, it will hopefully ring bells. And what I found is that students are pretty good at working out what applies to them if you're specific enough in the feedback. So for example, this one here, focus on one clear point per paragraph. Don't front load your what statement with lots of adjectives. Women are presented as dominant, manipulative, powerful, unusual. They can see that in their work. They can see if they've done that. They've used a range of adjectives about women. I found that students on the whole are really good at this. And where I know students are not going to be good at this, or where I think that they need more support, I think I'm going to use the whole number thing to we're always refining and reviewing this. I think putting numbers next to it is probably a good way to go. I've put in bold here the thing that I thought that the class in general needed to work on. I think as a class we were so fixated at the moment on trying to work out how you move from extract to whole effectively, that what happened was that students weren't sticking with their quotations and analysing them in depth. So what we did after going through this feedback is we exploded a quotation or two. So we started off with fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air, and we really picked that apart and looked at the range of things that you could say about that quotation to demonstrate how you could do that in your essay. And what I want to see from them is squeezing the life out of quotations, really, that they're not tempted to move on. I want them to stick with it and drill into it. And it was a really good exercise, actually. We enjoyed that. What I've also put on this sheet here is I had some one-to-ones. Now, what I've said to my year 11s is, over the course of this year, everybody's name will appear here at some point, and it's not an indication of you doing particularly badly or anything like that. It's because I would just want to talk to you all at a one-to-one level at some point. So students are aware of that this isn't a kind of name and shame thing here that's one-to-one. This is us having a conversation about their work, and students appreciate that, I think, having that chance to have a chat. So here is my visualizer station. So imagine that this side of the photo, imagine where the photo has been taken from, is my desk, and then I've pushed this student desk in front of my desk. There's a gap here that I can stand in if I needed to. So I can touch the visualizer, but students don't. Students just put their books there. And so when I'm sharing it to the class, it will go up on the whiteboard. But if I'm doing a one-to-one, the whiteboard will be turned off. I will be sat at my computer back here at a 2-metre distance, and students can be stood with their books. They can see their book, I can see their book, and we can have a conversation. And that's worked really, really well, because I've missed this opportunity to walk around, stand next to students, talk to them one-to-one about their exercise books, about what they've written in their books, and this has allowed me to have that conversation with them. There were a few questions. So I said, when I advertised that I was going to be doing this, I said, if you've got any questions, then pop them below and I'll try and answer them. So I just thought I would try and, the ones that I don't think I've been able to answer in the main body of this, which I think needed kind of placing here. So I hope I'll be able to answer them for you. So the first one, how can I utilise whole class feedback when attendance is sporadic? And I think I addressed that actually a little bit earlier on. I think you've got to think about the fact that the student, if they had done that work, would probably have made the same errors as everybody else. So in a way, that's a good thing about whole class feedback, because they're going to hear the common errors and misconceptions which will apply to them when they do that task. But also thinking about how to use your feedback lessons so they've got something to be getting on with that doesn't involve redrafting. So it just takes planning. But because you're not spending so long writing a student's book, you're freed up to think about how to use that feedback lesson effectively. So you're spending time on the thing that's really important, thinking about the feedback lesson and how you're going to use it to make sure that students are moving forward. And I think that, you know, so much time is wasted pouring writing to students' book that you're not spending the time that's going to have the biggest impact, which is going to be what's going to happen next in the teaching and the lesson that follows that's going to make a difference. So I think that you've got time and space to think about those students who are absent, and sometimes it might be that you ask them to do a paragraph, and perhaps they bring it up to you and you can have a look at it and you can give them personal feedback, but there's ways you can work around it for sure. How do I get everyone on board? Let me answer that bit first. It's really easy to get teachers on board with this, or I found it's really easy, because once they've done it and they've seen how quick it is, it's hard not to be keen on the idea. It's so much quicker. So what I did was I didn't mandate this. Certainly didn't a few years ago. I didn't say this is how you had to do things. I trialed it. Then a few others in my team trialled it, and then it became something that I said I think we should all move towards. It was a kind of encouraging the team to move forward with whole class feedback. We did a few training sessions on it, but it wasn't a difficult process, because once teachers had used it a few times, they were taken with the idea, because it allowed them to get through a set of books much more quickly and give really useful feedback. How have you ensured this approach is consistent across your team? Well, I Do care that students are getting feedback lessons regularly. So every other week in English, we're getting feedback lessons. Students are getting feedback lessons. I don't really care about us all using exactly the same form or doing the same things in feedback lessons. I want to, or even focusing on the same thing. So I don't say that teachers have to, so as a department, for example, in year 10, this past term, we've been looking at AQ English Language Paper 1. What I haven't said is this week you need to look at Paper 1, Question 2, whatever. Teachers are moving through slightly different paces and exploring different examples. And what they might find when they take in the books is that they want to focus on a particular question. And so therefore, I want them to respond to what's happened in the lesson and what's the most important thing to give feedback on. So there's not consistency of what's being marked necessarily, because we just call it a diagnostic book look. It is more consistent with year 11 because I set the essays that we're doing across every other week. But the issues that there will be in different classrooms will be different. And I don't really mind that the format might be different. So I don't mind if one teacher uses a template, one teacher writes on a sheet and shows the sheet. Some people print it, some people don't. What I do want to see is I want to see that feedback is happening every other week, in that way at least. And I want to see that students are using a whole lesson. And that's what I've been clear about with my team. So how have I ensured that? Or just being really clear about expectations. And I'm very lucky to work with a department who are see the value of those feedback lessons, and they're built into our medium-term plans and long-term plans. So it's something that we allow time for in our curriculum planning. What do you want to see in books after whole class feedback? Well, that depends. I would want to see I guess that I know it's feedback lesson. I expect the title of the lesson to be feedback lesson. Other than that, it really will depend on what the teacher thinks is the best thing that's going to help move students forward. So sometimes that will be the whole class being taught something and making a few notes on that. It might be that they're redrafting. It might be a closed exercise. It might be personalised tasks for a few people in the class. So what I want to see in books is that feedback has happened. What they're actually doing that lesson, it's up to the teachers to decide what's going to be the most effective way to use that lesson. And to be fair, sometimes there won't be lots and lots of writing in the feedback lesson, because it may very well be that you've worked as a class on something up on the board. And I don't think we should be scared of the fact that you're not always going to get lots and lots of writing in books. I'm just going to repeat something I said earlier. It's about what is the thing that's going to help them move forward, rather than worrying about evidencing this. That's not what I'm concerned about. How do I sell this to SLT? Well, that can be tricky. I mean, luckily I don't work in a school where that has been difficult. I guess the way I sold it to my SLT was to trial it, to have a look at the impact, to talk about the timeliness of feedback, it was something that very quickly had an impact on well-being. And I think that at the moment that's probably something that's forefront of head teachers and SLT's mind, is the well-being of their staff. And I think that you can sell this as being important for that, but also it's important for students to get timely feedback, and teachers are much more likely to give timely feedback using whole class feedback than more traditional laborious ways of giving feedback by marking every single book and writing lots and lots and lots of students' books. It's a tricky one to unpick, because I think it's really context dependent about how you sell it. If you've got a specific issue with this, or then by all means contact me, and I'll see if I can help you with that one, because it will depend. How do you do whole class feedback when your school's marking policy says books to be marked twice a half term plus assessments? Well, it depends. I guess if your whole school marking policy says books need to be marked twice a half term, well, you can use whole class feedback to do that. I've seen some whole class feedback sheets where it's got, you can leave a blank bit where you could write a mark on there, I guess, but it's whether they would see whole class feedback as marking. And I think that you could probably argue that it is, that you've got the feedback sheet stuck in, and that would count as marking. But I mean, I think it wouldn't be a bad thing if more schools moved away from this just mad kind of regular assessment. Just let students learn and then use summative assessments appropriately and at reasonable intervals, because anyway, that's a topic for another day. More questions. Can you use whole class feedback for summative assessments? Well, I guess this is an argument about what the assessment is for. So we largely use it for formative assessments, which is all of the assessments that we do in the course of the year, apart from our end of big term assessments. So we have multiple choice question assessments at Key Stage 3 at the end of the autumn term, and then at the end of the Easter term it's multiple choice question plus some kind of application, and at the end of the year it's end of year exams. Year 10s and 11s have the mock exams. They also do assessment at the end of the year. They do multiple choice question and a applied thing. So we largely use it for formative assessment. I think that with summative assessments, that is about tracking where you are, and less about kind of the what went well, even better if kind of side of things. But you can use whole class feedback for summative assessments, because of course you would want to get feedback about general strengths and areas for improvement. But I guess it just depends how regularly and how you're doing assessments in your school. How do you demonstrate to students that this method is worthwhile when some might question that you haven't marked their book? How do you ensure that pupils feel they are supported and their work has been recognised? Now, this is an interesting one about haven't marked their book. We, in English, haven't put marks in students' books for the past 2 or 3 years, and students just don't ask, or haven't asked. Certainly, I can't remember the last time students have asked me about putting a mark in their book, and instead they know that we're going to be talking about what they can do and what they need to do to improve. And how do you ensure that they feel supported? Well, and recognised. This is where, when you know a class and you're giving whole class feedback, you recognise them. You try and make sure that every student's name appears at some point on your whole class feedback. But also, because you've just read them the day before, you can make a personal comment in the lesson. You can say to them, "Oh, so and so, I'm so impressed," and that they know that you've read it. And I did that the other week, and I said, "I loved this about it." And she went, "How can you remember that?" And you can, because it's so recent. Has whole class feedback affected the progress learners make, positively or negatively? I think it hasn't had a detrimental impact on progress. I can see, for example, with the Macbeth work that we've been doing, I'm thinking particularly with year 11s, I can see from the feedback that I've given that students' essay writing is improving, despite the fact that I've not written individual comments in students' books. It's having a positive, it's really effective way of giving feedback, particularly because it sharpens your mind about thinking about how to use the feedback lesson and giving time for that feedback. How do you use it to motivate those that don't complete the work or do it badly? How do you avoid it being public humiliation? Well, in terms of not completing the work or doing it badly, they see some really good examples and they get given a task that's going to support them with working on the targets in that lesson. How do you avoid it about being public humiliation? Well, you don't need to write everything from your scribbly notes onto the whole class feedback sheet. You can just make sure that you have a one-to-one with that student, you have a chat with them. You can use numbers or codes, so you don't need to, I don't think it should be a form of public humiliation at all. So that is the end of this session on whole class feedback. I hope it's been helpful and I hope it's been useful. If you have any questions to me about how to do whole class feedback, or any challenges or questions about what you've seen in today's session, then by all means tweet me and I'll get back to you. And I will maybe see you in this way again in the future, or this might be the last one, who knows. Have a good half term. You deserve it. Bye bye.